The heart monitor beeped steadily in the ICU room, a slow mechanical rhythm that had nothing to do with love, vows, or forever, and yet this was where the wedding was happening. She stood beside the hospital bed in a simple white dress that still smelled faintly of starch and fear, her fingers trembling as they hovered over a clipboard instead of a bouquet. The man she was about to marry lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, dark lashes resting against pale skin, a breathing tube rising and falling with the machine beside him. He was a stranger, a millionaire CEO, her sister's fiancé, and he was in a coma. The nurse cleared her throat softly, the lawyer adjusted his tie, and the pen was placed into her shaking hand. All it would take was one signature, one name, one irreversible decision. She swallowed hard, knowing this was not a proposal, not a choice, not a dream she had ever imagined, but a sacrifice her family had decided she was born to make. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The lawyer's voice was calm and practiced as he explained the documents again, as if repetition could make this moment feel normal, reminding her that the marriage was a legal necessity, that the hospital required a lawful spouse to continue certain treatments, that the family trust demanded a married status to prevent assets from freezing, and that her sister had disappeared 3 days earlier with no intention of coming back. Her parents stood against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor, their silence heavier than any argument, because this decision had already been made long before she stepped into the room. She glanced at the man in the bed, at the faint scar near his temple, at the quiet strength of a face that once ruled boardrooms and headlines, and wondered if he could hear her, if somewhere behind the darkness he knew his life was being rewritten without his consent. The pen slipped slightly in her grip, leaving a small ink mark on the paper, and her mother whispered that it would only be temporary, that it was just a formality, that she was strong enough to do this for the family. Strong enough. The word echoed bitterly in her chest as she remembered how her sister had always been the beautiful one, the ambitious one, the chosen one, while she had learned early that her role was to comply, to step in when things broke, to fix what others abandoned. The nurse asked gently if she was ready, and for a moment she imagined saying no, imagined walking out of the room, imagined choosing herself for once. But the sound of the heart monitor pulled her back, each beep a reminder that time was running out, that if she walked away now, this man might never wake up at all. She leaned closer to the bed, her voice barely above a whisper, and said she was sorry, not knowing whether she was apologizing to him or to herself, before pressing the pen firmly to the paper and signing her name. The lawyer nodded, the nurse noted the time, and just like that, without vows or witnesses who cared, without a kiss or a promise, she became a wife to a man who could not open his eyes, unaware that this single act of forced duty would set in motion something no contract, no family, and no amount of money could ever control. The marriage papers were filed within the hour, and by sunset she was no longer a guest in the ICU, but his legal wife, a title that felt too heavy for how quietly it had been handed to her. She did not go home that night. There was no home waiting for her anymore, not the one she grew up in, and not the small apartment she had shared with her sister before everything collapsed. Instead, she sat alone in the hospital corridor, clutching her purse like a life raft, listening to the distant sounds of carts rolling and nurses speaking in low voices, as if the world itself was trying not to wake the man she had just married. That was when the weight of it finally pressed down on her chest, not as panic, but as a slow realization that her life had just been rerouted without her permission. Her phone buzzed with messages she did not open, all from family members reminding her of responsibilities, of gratitude, of how proud they were that she had done the right thing. No one asked how she felt. No one asked if she was afraid. When the doctor approached her, his tone was gentle but clinical, explaining that as the spouse she would now be responsible for medical decisions if the situation worsened, that she might need to authorize procedures, extend care, or one day make choices no one should have to make for a stranger. She nodded through it all, memorizing words she never imagined would apply to her life, and signed again where she was told, her name beginning to feel less like an identity and more like a signature that belonged to someone else. Later that night, she stood at his bedside alone, the room dim except for the soft glow of machines, and allowed herself to look at him properly for the first time, not as a problem to be solved, but as a man frozen in time. She noticed the faint crease between his brows, the kind that came from thinking too much, the calloused hands that suggested a life built on control and decision, and she wondered what kind of person he had been before the accident, before wealth and power and expectations swallowed him whole. She spoke to him quietly, telling him things she would never say to her family, admitting that she did not want this, that she had been afraid to say no, that she did not know how to be someone's wife when she had barely figured out how to be herself. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to her confession, but she found herself hoping, irrationally, that somewhere inside the darkness he could hear her. The following morning introduced her to a new reality. Nurses addressed her with polite respect. Hospital staff deferred to her decisions. Lawyers called to confirm documents. Her parents arrived briefly, offering thanks instead of comfort, already discussing trust clauses and future implications as if she were a temporary solution, not a person. When they left, relief washed over her, followed immediately by loneliness. She realized that this marriage had cost her more than her freedom. It had quietly erased her place in her own family. With nowhere else to go, she returned to the ICU room and pulled a chair close to the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest as if it were the only proof that time was still moving forward. She learned his routines from the nurses, the hours when his vitals were strongest, the times when the room was quietest, and without anyone asking her to, she began staying longer, adjusting his blanket, reading the names on charts, learning the language of beeps and numbers. She told herself she was doing this because she had to, because it was part of the role she had been forced into. But somewhere between midnight and dawn, as she rested her head against the edge of the bed and whispered that she hoped he would wake up one day, she understood something unsettling. This was no longer just about duty. It was about survival. And whether she liked it or not, her fate was now tied to a man who could not yet open his eyes, unaware that the woman sitting beside him had already given up everything to stay. By the third day, the word wife had stopped sounding unreal and started feeling like a rule she had to follow carefully, because every rule came with consequences she could not afford to misunderstand. The lawyer returned that morning with another folder, thicker than the first, and explained that while the marriage was now legally binding, there were boundaries, expectations, and protections that needed to be clearly defined, not for love, but for control. She listened as clauses were read aloud in a calm, indifferent voice, clauses that reduced her role to a set of permissions and limitations, stating that she would not represent the family publicly, that she would not make independent financial decisions, that she would remain physically present for medical appearances only, and that her responsibilities were confined to caregiving and compliance. It was not called a contract of affection or commitment. It was called a temporary marital agreement, drafted to protect assets, reputations, and futures that did not include her. She signed again, feeling the strange numbness that comes when a person realizes resistance would only cause more harm. After the lawyer left, the room felt quieter than before, as if the air itself had decided to stop taking sides. She stood beside the bed, holding the pen long after the ink had dried, and wondered how a life could be divided so cleanly into what was allowed and what was forbidden. The nurses soon made it clear what her days would look like. Morning vitals, medication checks, limited visiting hours, quiet conversations. She was shown where to store her coat, where to sit without blocking equipment, and which buttons she should never touch. No one questioned why she stayed. No one asked why she learned so quickly. As the days passed, she began to move through the ICU with a purpose she did not recognize as her own, arriving before shift changes, memorizing schedules, noticing patterns. She learned that his blood pressure stabilized in the late afternoon, that the room felt warmer when the blinds were opened just an inch, that the machines responded to adjustments with subtle changes in tone. She started speaking to him then, not because anyone told her to, but because the silence felt heavier when she did not. She told him small things at first, harmless things, about the weather outside, about the cafeteria coffee, about how strange it felt to be married without ever hearing his voice. There were moments when she paused, convinced she had said too much to someone who could not answer, but each time she considered stopping, she found herself continuing anyway. At night, when the hospital lights dimmed and the world narrowed to the quiet breathing of machines, she would sit with her hands folded in her lap, staring at his face, searching for signs that were probably not there, but hoping anyway. She noticed the faint tightening of his fingers when she adjusted the blanket, the almost imperceptible change in his heartbeat when her voice softened. And though the doctors dismissed these details as coincidence, she began to feel that something was happening beneath the surface, something fragile and unfinished. Her family called less often now, their concern replaced by reassurance that everything was being handled, that she should be grateful for the security this marriage provided. She did not argue. She did not explain. Instead, she returned to the hospital each morning, taking her place beside the bed like it was a job she could not resign from. Somewhere between obligation and routine, a quiet transformation began, not in him, but in her. She stopped counting the hours. She stopped waiting for permission. She started caring because it felt wrong not to. And though the contract defined her role as temporary, something unspoken was forming in the space between her voice and his silence, something no document had anticipated, something that would not remain contained for long. By the end of the first week, the hospital room no longer felt like a place she visited but a place she belonged to, and the routine of caring for him settled into her body with a strange familiarity that surprised her. Each morning began the same way, with her arriving before sunrise, washing her hands carefully, greeting the nurses by name, and checking the small details that no one had assigned to her, but that she had claimed anyway: the angle of the pillow, the dryness of his lips, the position of his hands resting too stiffly at his sides. She learned how to move quietly so the machines would not alarm, how to read the subtle language of numbers on the monitor, and how to tell when the room felt wrong even if nothing appeared to have changed. The nurses noticed her consistency and slowly stopped correcting her, allowing her to help with simple tasks, to hold a cloth while they worked, to remain close instead of being ushered out. She began speaking to him more freely then, filling the silence with stories that were never meant to be important, but somehow felt necessary. Describing the way the sky looked from the parking lot, the conversations she overheard in the hallway, the strange irony of being married to someone she was only now getting to know. She told him about her childhood, about growing up in the shadow of her older sister, about learning early that love in her family often came with conditions, and she admitted quietly that she did not know how long she could remain strong if he never woke up. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, but there were moments when it seemed to respond to her presence, its pace shifting almost imperceptibly when her voice softened or when she lingered longer than usual by his side. One afternoon, as she gently adjusted his blanket, his fingers twitched against the sheet, a movement so small it could have been dismissed as nothing, yet it froze her in place, her breath catching as she stared at his hand, willing it to happen again. The nurse explained calmly that such movements were common, reflexive, meaningless, but the look in her eyes betrayed a hope she could not hide. From that moment on, she paid closer attention, noting every subtle change, every flicker of response, every sign that suggested he might not be as unreachable as everyone believed. She began reading to him in the evenings, choosing books at random from the hospital library, her voice steady even when the words stirred emotions she did not fully understand, and when she finished, she would sit quietly, holding his hand for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if daring the world to tell her she did not belong there. Her family called less frequently now, satisfied that the arrangement was holding, and when they did, their questions focused on progress and logistics rather than her well-being, reinforcing what she already knew, that her value to them had always been measured by usefulness. Yet in this room, in the quiet hours when no one was watching, she felt seen in a way she never had before, not by him, not yet, but by the act of caring itself, by the sense that her presence mattered even if no one acknowledged it. There were nights when exhaustion caught up to her, when she rested her head briefly against the side of the bed and allowed herself to imagine a future she had not planned, one where he opened his eyes and asked who she was, one where she had to explain everything, including why she stayed when leaving would have been easier. The routine continued, day after day, not dramatic, not celebrated, but steady and intentional, And with each passing hour, the line between obligation and choice grew thinner, until even she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began, unaware that this quiet devotion was laying the groundwork for something that would soon demand to be seen. The second week brought a shift that no chart could explain and no doctor wanted to name, a subtle change that settled into the room like a held breath, making every moment feel charged with possibility. She noticed it first in the quiet hours, when the hospital seemed to pause between shifts and the noise of the world softened into distant echoes, because that was when his presence felt less distant, less unreachable. His breathing seemed deeper then, more deliberate, and his heartbeat, once steady and indifferent, began to respond in small ways to her voice, quickening slightly when she spoke close to him and easing when she slowed her words, as if coaxing him back from somewhere far away. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was coincidence or imagination fueled by exhaustion. Yet she continued speaking anyway, describing her day, her thoughts, and the things she had never said aloud before, trusting the silence to keep her secrets. She told him about the moment she signed the marriage papers, about how her hand had shaken and how she had felt like she was stepping into someone else's life, and she admitted that at first she had stayed because she was afraid of what would happen if she did not, afraid of disappointing everyone who had already decided her role for her. But as the days passed, her reasons had changed, quietly and without permission, into something harder to define. She spoke of mornings when she arrived early just to sit beside him before anyone else came in, of the strange comfort she found in the predictability of his presence, and of how the hospital no longer felt cold when she was with him. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the blinds and traced faint patterns across his face, she felt his fingers tighten around hers, not a twitch this time, not a reflex that could be dismissed, but a deliberate, fragile squeeze that made her heart race as she leaned closer, whispering his name even though no one had told her she was allowed to use it. The nurse who entered moments later insisted it was still too early to draw conclusions, that the brain often sent confusing signals during recovery, but the look she gave said something else, something cautious and hopeful that mirrored the feeling growing in her chest. From that day forward, the room felt different, as if an invisible thread had been tied between them, connecting her voice to his body in ways she could not ignore. She began to believe that he could hear her, that somewhere beneath the layers of silence he was listening, and that belief changed how she spoke, how she moved, how she stayed. She started telling him about her dreams, the small ones she had never pursued, and the larger ones she had abandoned because they did not fit into the life her family expected, and in doing so, she realized how long it had been since anyone had simply listened to her without judgment. At night, she would sit with her head bowed close to his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin and the steady reassurance of his pulse, and she would imagine him waking up, not as the powerful millionaire everyone spoke of, but as the man who had unknowingly become her anchor in a life that had always felt unsteady. Her family's calls became background noise, their concerns distant and impersonal compared to the reality unfolding quietly at his bedside, and when they spoke of timelines and contingencies, she found herself bristling in ways she never had before, protective of something she had not planned to claim. She did not yet understand what this connection meant or where it would lead, but she knew one thing with startling clarity, that the marriage which began as an obligation had created a bond no contract had predicted, and that whatever happened next, she was no longer just staying because she had to. She was staying because she could not imagine leaving him alone in the dark again. The night everything changed arrived without warning, wrapped in the kind of quiet that makes even familiar places feel uncertain, and she almost missed it because she was doing what she always did, sitting beside him and speaking softly as if tomorrow were guaranteed. The hospital lights were dimmed, the hallway outside nearly empty, and the heart monitor kept its steady rhythm as she told him about a dream she had the night before, a simple dream where he was awake and asking her why she looked so tired. She laughed softly at herself for imagining such things, then reached to adjust the blanket when she felt it, a sudden pressure around her fingers, unmistakable and warm. Her breath caught as she froze in place, her eyes locked on his hand, which was no longer resting lifelessly against the sheet, but holding hers, weakly but deliberately, as if responding to her presence after weeks of silence. She whispered his name again, her voice trembling, afraid that if she spoke too loudly the moment would disappear, and as if summoned by the sound, his eyelids fluttered, once, then again, before slowly opening to reveal eyes clouded with confusion and light. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The machines continued their work, but she could hear nothing except the rush of blood in her ears as she leaned closer, tears blurring her vision, trying to understand what she was seeing. His gaze drifted across the room, unfocused and searching, until it found her face, and when it did, something shifted in his expression, a faint recognition that did not yet have a name. His lips moved, struggling against muscles that had not worked in too long, and when a sound finally escaped, it was barely audible, rough and uncertain, but unmistakably real. Wife. The word shattered her composure, sending tears down her cheeks as she nodded and squeezed his hand back, assuring him that she was there, that he was not alone, that help was coming. She pressed the emergency button with shaking hands, her voice breaking as she called for the nurses, and within seconds the room filled with movement, doctors rushing in, voices overlapping as they checked vitals and adjusted equipment, their faces a mixture of disbelief and professional focus. She stepped back instinctively, making space, but he did not release her hand, his grip weak yet determined, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just returned to him. The doctors asked questions he could not yet answer, shone lights into his eyes, and exchanged looks that spoke of cautious optimism, while she stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold in front of her. When the room finally settled and the initial rush subsided, the doctor turned to her and confirmed what she already knew in her heart, that he had regained consciousness, that recovery would be slow and uncertain, but that this moment was real and irreversible. She returned to his side then, her emotions overwhelming and unfiltered, and as she leaned close, he searched her face again, his brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to place her in a memory he could not yet access. He asked her name, his voice hoarse and fragile, and she told him, smiling through tears, explaining that she was his wife, careful not to burden him with details he was not ready to hear. He nodded slowly, accepting the information with the trust of someone who had no reason to doubt her, and closed his eyes briefly, exhausted by the effort of waking. As the nurses adjusted his bed and encouraged her to rest, she remained seated, holding his hand and watching his chest rise and fall, the reality of what had happened slowly settling into her bones. The man she had married in silence was awake, bound to her now not just by ink and obligation, but by the first conscious word he had spoken in weeks, and as she sat there in the aftermath of the miracle she had secretly prayed for, she realized with startling clarity that this was no longer a story she was surviving. It was a story that had just begun. The days after he woke were filled with cautious hope and careful omissions, because while his body began the slow work of recovery, his memory remained fragmented, leaving her to navigate a truth that felt too heavy to deliver all at once. Doctors explained that confusion was normal, that his mind would need time to reconnect with the world it had been torn from, and she took refuge in that explanation, answering his questions with gentleness but restraint, telling him only what he needed to feel safe. He asked about the accident, about the pain in his head, about the strange sense that weeks had been stolen from him, and she stayed by his side, reassuring him that he was healing, that she would explain everything when he was stronger. At first, the hospital felt united in that decision, but it did not last. His family returned quickly once the news spread, their relief sharp and controlled, followed closely by suspicion as they took in the sight of her sitting beside him, holding his hand like it had always been her place. Conversations began to happen just outside the room, voices lowered but urgent, and she could feel the shift in the air as questions turned into assumptions. One afternoon, while he slept, his mother asked her directly how long she planned to continue this performance, reminding her that the engagement had belonged to her sister, not her, and that gratitude did not equate to permanence. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed the fear she had been trying to outrun since the moment he opened his eyes. The truth, once delayed, arrived anyway. It came not from her, but from a lawyer who assumed he was ready, casually mentioning the engagement that preceded, the accident, the contract that followed, and the sister who had vanished when things became inconvenient. He listened quietly from the bed, his expression unreadable as pieces fell into place, and when the lawyer left, the silence between them felt heavier than it ever had before. He turned his head slowly to look at her, searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten, and asked why she had not told him sooner. She did not defend herself. She did not shift blame. She told him the truth, all of it, admitting that she had been forced, that the marriage had been a legal solution, that she had stayed because she was expected to, and then because she chose to. Her voice shook as she spoke, not from fear of his anger, but from the possibility that he would see her now as everyone else did, as a replacement, a mistake, a temporary solution to a problem that should never have belonged to her. He absorbed her words in silence, his jaw tightening as he processed the betrayal layered beneath what he had believed to be a miracle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but distant, asking her if she would have stayed if there had been no contract, no obligation, no pressure from his family. She hesitated, and that hesitation answered him more loudly than any confession could. The space between them grew strained in the days that followed, filled with unspoken questions and guarded interactions. His family pushed for clarity, for annulment, for restoration of what they considered the correct order, while she found herself quietly excluded from decisions she had once been responsible for, reminded at every turn that her place was conditional. She considered leaving then, stepping aside before resentment could replace the fragile connection they had built, but each time she tried to imagine walking away, she saw the way his eyes followed her when she moved across the room, the way his hand reached instinctively for hers before stopping, unsure of what he was allowed to want. The conflict was no longer about legality or contracts or family expectations. It was about trust, about whether something born out of obligation could survive the truth without collapsing under its weight. And as she stood at the edge of a decision she never wanted to make, she understood that whatever happened next would no longer be decided by paperwork or pressure, but by whether he believed that what she had given him, in his darkest hours, had been real. The decision came not in a quiet moment between them, but in a room filled with voices, because the truth they were circling could no longer survive in private. The hospital scheduled a formal meeting to discuss next steps, and suddenly the small ICU room expanded into a space crowded with doctors, legal advisors, and family members who spoke with the confidence of people used to being obeyed. He sat upright now, still weak but alert, his recovery visible in the way he followed every word, and she stood slightly behind him, unsure whether she was still meant to be there at all. The lawyer began by outlining options with clinical precision, mentioning annulment, asset protection, and public statements, framing the marriage as an unfortunate but correctable complication that arose under extreme circumstances. His mother nodded along, already speaking of restoring order, of bringing his life back to what it was supposed to be, and when her sister arrived unexpectedly, composed and unapologetic, the room shifted again, as if the final piece of an uncomfortable puzzle had been placed on the table. Her sister spoke confidently, claiming confusion and fear, insisting she had never agreed to step aside permanently, and thanking her for holding things together while she was gone, the words sharp enough to cut. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of it, every instinct telling her to step away and let the rightful people reclaim their places, but before she could move, his voice cut through the noise. It was still rough, still carrying the effort of recovery, but it was steady, and it commanded the room in a way no legal document ever could. He asked them all to stop, then turned to look at her fully, really looking at her for the first time since learning the truth, seeing not a replacement or a convenience, but the woman who had been there when no one else stayed. He spoke slowly, choosing words that felt earned, explaining that while the marriage may have begun as a legal solution, everything that followed had been real, the nights she sat beside him, the voice that guided him back, the hands that did not let go when there was no reason to. Hold on. He addressed his family directly, reminding them that contracts could create obligations, but they could not create loyalty, and that the person who stood beside him now had given him something none of them could claim, presence without expectation. The lawyer attempted to interject, suggesting a temporary suspension, a neutral arrangement until he was fully recovered, but he shook his head, refusing to delay a decision that had already been made in his heart. He reached for her hand then, openly, deliberately, and announced that there would be no annulment, no quiet erasure of what had happened, because he was choosing to honor the woman who had honored him when he could not speak for himself. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that follows when power changes hands, and for the first time, she felt something loosen inside her chest. Her sister protested, her mother objected, and the lawyer warned of complications, but none of it mattered anymore, because the choice had been made in the only place that mattered. Later, when the room emptied and the noise faded, she finally allowed herself to sit beside him again, overwhelmed by what had just happened and unsure how to respond to a decision she had never expected him to make. He told her quietly that he did not know what the future would look like, that recovery would take time, and that trust would need rebuilding on both sides, but that he wanted that future to include her, not because of obligation, not because of sacrifice, but because when he woke up to the world again, she was the first person who made it feel safe. In that moment, she understood that the marriage that began as a solution had transformed into something else entirely, something chosen in full awareness, and as she squeezed his hand in response, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was not being asked to step aside. She was being chosen. Time softened the sharp edges of what they had survived, not by erasing the past, but by placing it where it finally belonged, behind them. His recovery moved slowly, measured in physical therapy sessions, cautious steps down hospital hallways, and quiet victories that no press release ever announced. And she stayed through all of it, no longer out of obligation, but because staying had become her choice. When he was discharged, there was no grand celebration, only a small moment at the hospital doors where he paused, looked back at the building that had nearly taken his life, then turned toward her and smiled with a gratitude that did not need words. They did not rush into a public statement or a rewritten narrative for the world. Instead, they went somewhere quiet, a modest home far from boardrooms and expectations, where healing could continue without an audience. There, in the ordinary rhythm of shared mornings and unremarkable evenings, they learned each other in ways that no dramatic beginning ever could, discovering habits, fears, and hopes that had nothing to do with contracts or sacrifices. He learned how she took her coffee, how she folded laundry with careful precision, how she still hesitated before speaking when she thought her voice might not matter, and she learned how deeply he carried responsibility, how the silence of recovery had changed him, how waking up to find her beside him had altered his understanding of trust forever. Months later, when his strength had returned and the shadows of the past no longer dictated every step, he asked her to walk with him one evening to the edge of the garden behind their home, where the air was warm and the world felt unhurried. He did not bring lawyers or witnesses or documents. He brought only a small box, worn at the edges from being carried longer than necessary, and when he opened it, she saw the ring she had once placed on his finger in the ICU, the same one that had marked a marriage born of necessity, now reset simply, honestly, without pretense. He told her that he did not want a marriage defined by what they had endured, but by what they chose to build next, and he asked her, not as a legal requirement or a sacrifice, but as a promise freely given, if she would marry him again, this time in full awareness and with no one watching but the truth between them. She answered without hesitation, her yes quiet but certain, and in that moment, the past finally loosened its hold. Their wedding was small, intentionally so, held in a place filled with light and familiarity rather than grandeur, attended by those who respected their story enough not to rewrite it. There were no speeches about fortune or resilience, only simple words about choice, kindness, and the courage it takes to stay when leaving would be easier. When she walked toward him, she was not carrying the weight of her family's expectations or the fear of being replaceable. She was carrying only herself, and he met her with the steady gaze of a man who knew exactly who he was choosing. As they exchanged vows, the ring found its place again, no longer a symbol of obligation, but of a bond tested and claimed by two people who had seen each other at their weakest and stayed anyway. Later, as the evening settled into laughter and quiet conversation, she caught him watching her with the same look he had worn the night he woke up, a look that spoke of recognition beyond memory, and she realized how far they had come from that first silent wedding in a hospital room. Their story did not end with a miracle or a dramatic declaration, but with something far rarer, a shared understanding that love does not always begin with choice. but it must end with one. And when the world finally grew quiet around them, they stood together not as a solution to a problem, but as partners who had found each other in the most unlikely way and chosen, deliberately and without regret, to stay.